It was a typical night shift, the kind where you find solace in the rhythmic hum of the engine and the dark, deserted roads that stretch endlessly into the night. I was driving back home after a long day at work, the moonlight casting a silver sheen over the deserted highway. It was past midnight when I saw him, a lone figure standing by the roadside, thumb outstretched, as if he were a beacon of human desperation in the vast emptiness. I had always been cautious about picking up hitchhikers, but something about this man struck me as different. Maybe it was the way he looked, with his disheveled clothes and vacant eyes, or perhaps it was the forlorn expression etched into his face. I slowed down and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The man hesitated, then nodded. As he climbed into the passenger seat, I noticed an odd chill in the air, like a draft of cold wind had swept into the car. He didn't speak for a while, just stared out of the window with a look of lost contemplation. I tried to make conversation, but he only responded with short, distracted answers. After some time, I took a turn off the main road onto a smaller, winding path. The trees grew denser here, their skeletal branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The man finally broke the silence. "Can you drop me off at the old house up ahead?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at him, puzzled. "The old house? I thought that place was abandoned." He simply nodded, not elaborating further. There was an unspoken urgency in his request that I couldn't ignore. I followed the winding path, and soon we reached a dilapidated mansion shrouded in darkness. The house was crumbling, its once grand architecture now reduced to an eerie silhouette against the night sky. As we arrived, the man gave me a faint, inscrutable smile. "Thank you," he said softly, then stepped out and walked towards the decrepit front door. I watched him for a moment, the eerie atmosphere making me shiver. Then, with a final glance at the man disappearing into the shadows, I drove away. The house lingered in my thoughts long after I left. The feeling of unease grew, but I dismissed it as the result of a long, tiring day. It wasn't until the next morning, while reading the local newspaper, that I stumbled upon a story that sent chills down my spine. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance at the Old House." The article described the old mansion as a local legend, linked to several strange disappearances over the decades. It mentioned that the house had been abandoned for over 30 years, and the most recent person to vanish had been a young man who had last been seen hitchhiking on the same road I had driven. According to the article, he had never been seen again after he was reportedly dropped off at the old house. I stared at the newspaper in disbelief. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The man I had picked up was not just a hitchhiker, he was a ghost, a restless spirit doomed to wander the roads forever. I had unknowingly given him his last ride. The day was spent in a fog of unsettling thoughts. That evening, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of guilt, compelled me to visit the old house again. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the overgrown lawn. I parked the car and approached the mansion, determined to find out more. The front door creaked open with a shuddering groan, revealing a dark, musty interior. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The air was thick with dust and decay. I explored the dark, empty rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. In one of the rooms I found an old photograph pinned to the wall. It was a faded image of a young man with the same vacant eyes I had seen in The Hitchhiker. Below the photograph was a note in shaky handwriting, "Help me. I'm lost." My heart pounded in my chest. I knew then that the hitchhiker's spirit had been trapped here for decades, his presence lingering in the house that had become his final resting place. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread and a compulsion to leave. As I turned to exit the room, I heard a faint whisper behind me. "Help me." I spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew colder, and I felt an invisible weight pressing down on me. Panic surged through me, and I fled from the house, stumbling over debris as I rushed outside. As I reached the safety of my car, I glanced back at the mansion. The windows seemed to watch me with an almost sentient awareness. The whispers of the past echoed in my ears, mingling with the creaks of the decaying house. I drove away, vowing never to return. The experience had left me shaken and deeply unsettled. To this day, I can't shake the image of that forlorn figure disappearing into the shadows of the old house. Every time I drive along that road, I'm haunted by the memory of the hitchhiker and the chilling realization that sometimes the past has a way of reaching out to claim those who unwittingly tread upon its dark and forgotten paths. The antique shop was a labyrinth of forgotten relics and dust-laden memories. My wife Sarah and I stumbled in on a whim while visiting the quaint town of Ravenswood. We were searching for a piece of local history to decorate our new home, but what we found was far more unsettling. Amidst the clutter of old furniture and faded paintings, there it was, a doll perched on a high shelf. Its porcelain face, though cracked and weathered, had an unsettlingly lifelike quality. The eyes, though glazed with age, seemed to follow us as we moved. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a knowing look, claimed it was a family heirloom, owned by a distant relative who had died under mysterious circumstances. "We'll take it," Sarah decided impulsively. I wasn't entirely sure why, but something about the doll seemed to beckon us. We packed it carefully and drove back to our home with an uneasy excitement. The first few nights were uneventful, but then the strange occurrences began. It started with soft, almost imperceptible noises in the night, a creaking floorboard, the distant sound of a child's laughter. I dismissed them as the house settling, but Sarah wasn't so sure. One evening, while we were unpacking boxes in the living room, the doll's head turned slightly. I chalked it up to a trick of the light or my own fatigue. But then Sarah saw it too. The doll's gaze was fixed directly on us, and it seemed as though its expression had subtly changed from a benign smile to something more sinister. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She claimed she heard whispers coming from the doll's direction. I laughed it off as a side effect of our overactive imaginations. But when I checked the doll, its position had shifted. It now sat on the edge of the mantel, facing directly into our bedroom. The following days brought more disturbances. Objects would move on their own, doors creaked open by themselves, and sometimes a cold, oppressive chill would settle in the rooms where the doll was present. One night, Sarah awoke to find the doll lying next to her on the bed. She swore she hadn't put it there. I was skeptical, attributing it to a sleepwalking incident, or perhaps a prank by our teenage son, Lucas. Then came the night of the storm. Thunder rumbled and lightning flashed, illuminating the house in intermittent bursts of light. We were woken by the sound of shuffling feet. I went downstairs to investigate and found the doll in the middle of the hallway, its head now turned completely backward. As I bent to pick it up, a cold, unnaturally strong force gripped my arm. I yanked away, but the sensation lingered. My skin prickled with the feeling of unseen eyes watching me. I returned the doll to its shelf and locked it in the attic for good measure, but the sense of dread only grew. The next day, Sarah and Lucas were gone. Panic surged through me as I searched the house, calling their names. When I finally found them, they were sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the doll. It had been placed back in its original position on the mantel. Sarah's eyes were vacant, her usual warmth replaced by a chilling indifference. Lucas, too, seemed affected, his playful demeanor replaced by a disturbing calm. I tried to communicate with them, but they were unresponsive, their gaze locked on the doll as though mesmerized. Desperation drove me to the local library, where I dug through old records and newspapers about the doll's previous owner. The story was grim. The doll had belonged to a woman named Evelyn Blackwood, who had been accused of witchcraft. After her death, the doll was rumored to have been cursed with the spirit of a malevolent entity. Her final frantic writings mentioned a dark force that could possess those who came into contact with the doll. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The doll wasn't just a relic. It was a vessel for something far more sinister. I had to get rid of it, but the thought of burning or disposing of it felt like inviting more harm. That night, the atmosphere in the house became suffocating. Shadows danced along the walls, and the whispers grew louder. The doll's eyes seemed to glow with a malevolent intelligence. I decided to confront it. I sat in front of the doll, attempting to reason with it. "You're not welcome here," I said, my voice trembling. "Leave my family alone." The room grew colder, and the doll's mouth moved in a silent, mocking smile. The temperature dropped further until I could see my breath. I felt a heavy weight on my chest as though something was pressing down on me. Then the doll's head turned, its eyes locking onto mine. "They belong to me," it whispered in a voice that wasn't quite human. In a burst of adrenaline-fueled courage, I grabbed the doll and hurled it into the fireplace. Flames roared to life, but as the doll burned, its eyes remained fixed on me, filled with a chilling sense of triumph. The room erupted into chaos as the fire crackled, and the house seemed to convulse with the doll's rage. In the aftermath, Sarah and Lucas slowly returned to their old selves, their memories of the doll hazy and fragmented. We moved away from that house shortly after, leaving behind the cursed remnants of our encounter. The experience left scars that never fully healed, and to this day, I shudder at the thought of that doll's eyes watching me from the shadows. As I write this, I can't help but wonder if the doll ever truly burned away, or if a piece of its malevolent essence still lingers somewhere, waiting for its next victim. I always considered myself a brave soul, and the abandoned hospital was my Everest. My friends, Jake, Emily, and Sam, shared my fascination with the macabre. The hospital had been closed for over a decade, shuttered after a series of inexplicable patient deaths. Rumor had it that the place was haunted, but none of us took that seriously. We were urban explorers, driven by the thrill of discovery and the thrill of debunking myths. Or so I thought. The hospital's exterior was as grim as I had imagined, crumbling bricks, broken windows, and an iron gate that groaned in protest as we pushed through. I led the way with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the encroaching darkness. We had planned to start on the top floor and work our way down, hoping to capture some decent photographs and maybe find a clue about why the hospital had been abandoned. The lobby was a cavernous space, eerily silent except for the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe. The air was thick with the musty scent of decay. As we moved deeper, the oppressive silence was broken only by our footsteps echoing off the cracked tile floors. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, but I dismissed it as mere anticipation. We found the elevator shaft and decided to take the stairs. The higher we climbed, the colder the air became. Jake, always the joker, started making ghost noises, trying to lighten the mood. We laughed at his antics until we reached the 4th floor. That's where the real horror began. A faint rhythmic sound caught our attention, a soft, persistent tapping, like a heartbeat. It led us to an old, decrepit nurse's station. The desk was covered in dust, and medical records lay scattered like forgotten memories. But it was what we found behind the desk that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. A diary with a name scrawled on the cover, Nurse Evelyn Hart. Emily opened the diary, flipping through pages filled with meticulous handwriting. The entries were about the patients, their ailments, and Evelyn's increasingly desperate attempts to save them. The final entries were frantic, detailing the strange deaths of patients who seemed to die in their sleep, their bodies found perfectly still, but with no clear cause of death. A chilling draft swept through the room, extinguishing our flashlights for a moment. When the lights flickered back on, a figure stood at the end of the hallway. She was dressed in a tattered nurse's uniform, her face obscured by shadows, but her presence was unmistakable. Her gaze, though hidden, seemed to pierce through us. "She must be a hallucination," Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "We've been here too long. Let's go." Before we could move, the figure turned and glided away, her footsteps echoing softly. We followed her, curiosity outweighing our fear. The nurse led us through a series of winding corridors until we reached a ward. The room was lined with empty beds, their metal frames rusting and decaying. The figure stopped by one of the beds and began to adjust the thin white sheets as if preparing for a new patient. We watched in stunned silence. The ghostly nurse seemed unaware of our presence, lost in her eternal duty. A heavy sense of dread filled the room, more suffocating than before. Suddenly, the lights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I glanced at the others. Their faces were as pale as mine. The nurse looked up then, her face still concealed, but her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Why are you here?" Her voice whispered through the darkness, a mournful lament. "You should not have come." Panic surged through me. "We're sorry. We didn't mean to intrude. We're leaving now." But as we turned to flee, the exit doors slammed shut, their metal clanging loudly. We were trapped. The nurse moved closer, her steps soundless on the floor, and the temperature dropped sharply. We could see our breath in the air. Jake, always the bravest, tried to force open the doors, but they wouldn't budge. Emily began to cry softly. The nurse hovered beside her, reaching out a spectral hand. "They all leave," the nurse said, her voice echoing with a sorrowful finality. "But I remain. I must tend to them." Desperation made us reckless. We searched for another way out, but every path seemed to lead back to the ward. The diary in my hand felt heavier with each passing second, as though it was pulling me back to the nurse's station. In a final desperate attempt, I opened the diary again and read aloud the final entry, hoping it would appease whatever was haunting us. The words were a plea for forgiveness, an apology for not being able to save the patients. The ghostly nurse stopped, her form trembling as if struggling with some inner turmoil. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice softer now. "I did my best. Forgive me." As if in response to the diary's plea, the doors creaked open. We didn't wait for another invitation. We bolted down the stairs, our hearts pounding in our chests. The oppressive feeling lifted as we crossed the threshold, and the gate slammed shut behind us with an almost relieved finality. Outside, we gasped for fresh air, the night seeming colder and darker than it had before. We looked back at the hospital, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Whatever had kept Nurse Evelyn trapped had been momentarily appeased by our intrusion. We never returned. The abandoned hospital stood as a grim reminder of what we had seen and experienced. But every so often, when the night is particularly still, I can almost hear the distant mournful tap of the spectral nurse's footsteps, forever tending to patients that no longer exist.